York, this is Democracy Now!
My name is Emilio Gonzalez Ayala. I'm a pulmonary and critical care specialist in El Paso, Texas. We're going to be discussing the surge in numbers of COVID-19 cases we're seeing here in town, as well as the overstretched resources we're dealing with in the hospitals with the limited amount of nurses, respiratory therapists, and physicians we have.
Over 1,700 people died Tuesday in the United States from COVID, in the deadliest day of the pandemic in 6 months. We go to El Paso, Texas, where authorities have set up 10 mobile morgues. Then to North Dakota, the deadliest state in the world for COVID. We'll look at how the virus has devastated Indian country.
Black Americans and Latinos are 3 times as likely to contract COVID as others and more likely to die. Native Americans are more than 4 times as likely to be hospitalized as others.
We'll speak to members of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota, the Oneida Nation in Wisconsin, and a Navajo activist in Arizona. We'll talk about COVID and the unprecedented voter turnout of Native Americans. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Over 1,700 people died in the United States Tuesday from COVID-19 in what's been described as the deadliest day of the pandemic in 6 months. The overall U.S. death toll is approaching a world high of 250,000. At least 20 states have broken new records for COVID-related hospitalizations. In news from Washington, D.C., 87-year-old Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley has tested positive for COVID-19. He's the oldest Republican in the Senate. He's its president pro tem, making him 3rd in line for the presidency. Grassley spoke from the Senate floor without his mask on Monday. During Monday's Senate session, Ohio's Sherrod Brown blasted Republicans for their wanton disregard of basic coronavirus protection measures and asked Alaskan Senator Dan Sullivan to wear a mask while he presided over the chamber.
I'd start by asking the presiding officer to please wear a mask as he speaks, and people below him are, I can't tell you what to do, but I know that the behavior...
I don't wear a mask when I'm speaking, like most senators.
Well, most senators...
So I'll put it back on, but I don't need your instruction from...
I know you don't need my instruction, but there clearly isn't much interest in this body in public health. We have a president who hasn't shown up at the coronavirus task force meeting in months. We have a majority leader that calls us back here to vote on an unqualified nominee and at the same time to vote for judge after judge after judge, exposing all the people who can't say anything, I understand, the people in front of you and the presiding officer, and expose all the staff here.
In medical news, the FDA has authorized the first at-home coronavirus test. The nasal swab requires a prescription and can produce results in about half an hour. President Trump has fired a top election security official at the Department of Homeland Security just days after he publicly rebuked Trump's claims the election was rigged. Christopher Krebs served as the director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Last week, the agency released a statement describing the 2020 election as, quote, the most secure in American history. Trump fired Krebs via a message on Twitter. Krebs responded with a tweet saying, "Honored to serve, we did it right, defend today, secure tomorrow, #protect 2020. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi called the firing a dangerous and shameful charade. Krebs' deputy, Matt Travis, has also been reportedly forced out of his job. In Michigan, election officials in the state's largest county certified Joe Biden's victory Tuesday night after a dramatic reversal. The 2 white Republicans on the Wayne County Board of Canvassers initially blocked certification, saying they did not want to include votes from Detroit, which overwhelmingly supported Biden. President Trump then took to Twitter to praise the Republican effort, saying, quote, "Having courage is a beautiful thing. The USA stands proud." Reverend Wendell Anthony, the president of the NAACP in Detroit, criticized the Republican efforts to disenfranchise votes in Detroit.
You have extracted a black city out of a county and said the only ones that are at fault, at an issue, is the city of Detroit, where 80% of the people who reside here are African Americans. Shame on you. Shame on you. You are a disgrace as relates to the ability to have a free and impartial election in this nation.
Ned Stabler, a vice president at Wayne State University in Detroit, also criticized the Republicans on the Wayne County Board of Canvassers.
I just want to let you know that the Trump stick, the stain of racism that you, William Hartman, and Monica Palmer have just covered yourself in, is going to follow you throughout history. Your grandchildren are going to think of you like Bull Connor or George Wallace.
President-elect Joe Biden announced more senior White House appointments Tuesday, among them Louisiana Congressmember, former Congressional Black Caucus Chair Cedric Richmond, who's been tapped to lead the White House Office of Public Engagement. Climate activists slammed the decision, with Sunrise Movement's Varshini Prakash saying, quote, "Today feels like a betrayal because one of President-elect Biden's very first hires for his administration has taken more donations from the fossil fuel industry during his congressional career than any other Democrat," she said. Sunrise Movement also accused Richmond of ignoring members of his community who have suffered from toxic pollution and sea level rise. The Senate voted Tuesday to block the confirmation of Trump nominee Judy Shelton to the board of the Federal Reserve. The 47-50 vote came after two Republican senators missed the vote, Chuck Grassley, who has COVID-19, and Florida's Rick Scott, who's quarantining after exposure to the virus. And two Republicans sided with Democrats, Mitt Romney and Susan Collins. Lamar Alexander was not present for the vote. Majority Leader Mitch McConnell changed his vote to no, a procedural maneuver that gives him the chance to bring her nomination up again later. Shelton's criticized the Fed's independence and has advocated returning to the gold standard, a controversial monetary system where the value of the dollar would be directly linked to gold. She's also been condemned for changing her views to line up with Trump's and for regularly scheduling press interviews at the Trump Hotel. As Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is scheduled to visit an illegal Israeli settlement in the occupied West Bank this week, over 40 House Democrats are calling on him to condemn the illegal demolition of the Bedouin community of Kiryat Hamza in the Jordan Valley by Israeli forces earlier this month, which left dozens of people homeless. The effort was led by Wisconsin Congressmember Mark Pocan, who said in a statement, quote, "There is no excuse for the de facto annexation of Palestinian land, and America cannot remain silent in the face of these human rights abuses any longer." The Iranian government's warned of a crushing response if the Trump administration strikes Iran's main nuclear site or attacks any of its allies in the region in the last 2 months of Trump's presidency. The New York Times reported this week Trump may still be looking for ways to attack Iran, despite advisors warning him a strike could escalate into a bigger conflict. Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed is rejecting international pleas to end Ethiopia's 2-week-old conflict and said military operations in the semi-autonomous northern state of Tigray are entering their final phase. Hundreds of people have died since Ethiopian troops began the attack on Tigray November 4th. More than 25,000 refugees have fled into Sudan. In Mexico, a group of 120 indigenous Otomi families have indefinitely moved into the Mexico City offices of the National Institute of Indigenous Peoples to demand an end to continuous government violence and neglect during the coronavirus pandemic and beyond. The occupation has been in place since Indigenous Peoples Day and is being led by Otomi women who are calling on the government to immediately meet their needs, including food security and access to health care, work, education, and housing. The U.S. government's agreed to drop all charges against Mexico's former Defense Secretary General Salvador Cienfuegos and to allow for his return to Mexico. Cienfuegos was arrested at Los Angeles International Airport in October and indicted on money laundering and drug trafficking charges. He had been accused of working with the Beltran-Leyva cartel to arrest and torture rivals in exchange for bribes. The Mexican government has not committed to arrest or charge Cienfuegos. He served as Defense Secretary under former President Enrique Peña Nieto. Back in the United States, President Trump is pushing through new rules making it harder for people to obtain government benefits. A new regulation will make it harder for people who are denied disability benefits to appeal by allowing the Social Security Administration to use its own lawyers to hear the appeals instead of administrative law judges who are more independent. Meanwhile, two pending rules would restrict eligibility criteria for food assistance, potentially kicking millions off the government plan. The Supreme Court Monday denied a request by elderly prisoners to require stronger pandemic precautions at a Texas prison, despite older people being much more vulnerable to the coronavirus. This comes as a group of prominent religious leaders and peace activists have called on New York Governor Andrew Cuomo to grant clemency to 76-year-old David Gilbert, a Weather Underground activist who's been behind bars for nearly 4 decades for his role in the murder of 2 police officers and a security guard in 1981. The letter to Governor Cuomo was signed by Nobel Peace Laureates, including Archbishop Desmond Tutu and the families of Martin Luther King Jr. and Mahatma Gandhi. And here in New York, ahead of an expected travel boom next week for Thanksgiving, airport workers rallied at LaGuardia Tuesday to demand Governor Andrew Cuomo sign the Healthy Terminals Act, which would provide 25,000 frontline airport service workers with access to health insurance. The majority of the workers are Black, brown, and immigrants. This is SEIU Local 32BJ President Kyle Bragg.
It is clearly a matter of life and death for these workers. This matter is a matter of humanity and of justice, and what side we will be on and remembered for in this crisis. Did we stand up for workers? Did we stand up for the airport workers, the essential workers who keep this place moving? Will they have the comfort and the security of a health care plan?
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, where the COVID numbers are going up, joined by my co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Jersey, where the numbers are escalating alarmingly. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
Well, over 1,700 people died from COVID Tuesday in the United States. It's the deadliest day of the pandemic in at least 6 months. As public health officials across the country brace for a COVID-19 surge from the Thanksgiving holiday and already record-high infection rates, some Republican governors are dropping their resistance to mask mandates, including Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, who imposed a limited mask mandate Tuesday. But many of these same governors continue to hold off on implementing other public health measures. In Texas, where coronavirus cases have reached record highs for a second time in the pandemic, Governor Greg Abbott says no new lockdown is coming. He's even pushing back on local policies in places like El Paso County, along the Mexico border, which is facing one of the worst COVID-19 outbreaks in the country, after the Texas Attorney General sued to stop and order closing non-essential businesses in El Paso. A Texas appeals court agreed with the challenge Thursday, which allowed businesses to open the next day. About 80% of El Paso residents are Latinx. The county now has 10 mobile morgues to hold bodies. Some prisoners are being paid just $2 an hour to move the bodies, as the numbers of cases and deaths has completely overwhelmed the hospitals. They are moving the corpses. A traveling nurse who worked at the El Paso University Medical Center spoke out about what she called a horrific scene for patients with COVID-19. In a Facebook video earlier this month, Luana Rivers also described a room she calls the pit, where she says patients were sent to die with minimal treatment.
They did not aggressively treat them as they should have. And according to their staff, the doctors at the hospital wasn't aggressive before COVID, but even with COVID. So I saw a lot of people die that I feel like shouldn't have died. Y'all, that assignment there broke me. I was put in what's called a pit. And in this pit was 8 patients, all COVID positive. My first day of orientation, I was told that whatever patients go into the pit, they only come out in a body bag. The patients that we coded, we were not allowed to bag them because we would get too much exposure, which I hadn't seen. And because they were COVID positive, this hospital's policy was they only get 3 rounds of CPR, which is only 6 minutes. Out of all the codes that we had there, there's not a single patient that made it. Y'all, when I say this assignment here, like literally almost destroyed me. Like I called my husband from there, I called my best friend from there, and I just cried. And I just said, what I'm seeing here is just not right.
That's visiting nurse Luana Rivers describing a hospital in El Paso. Well, for more, we go to El Paso to speak with Dr. Emilio Gonzalez Ayala, a leading pulmonary disease and critical care specialist. Thanks so much for taking the time, Dr. Ayala, to speak to us today. If you can start off by describing the situation in El Paso, so extreme that the county administrator tried to put major restrictions in El Paso, and the governor prevented them from being implemented?
Yeah, unfortunately, we've been facing these decisions by the government of the state. And obviously, as you mentioned before, the mandate to close non-essential businesses has impacted us in a significant way, because we continue to see the surge of numbers in the hospitals, in the ERs throughout the city, and we're at capacity. We're beyond the limit where we can continue to admit to the hospital patients that come in critically ill, and we're flying them out directly from the ER to other hospitals in the state where they can be admitted and treated. We are keeping a large number of intubated, mechanically ventilated patients in the ER waiting for beds to open in the ICU. But sometimes these patients are too unstable and too critically ill to continue waiting there. So we need to make space for them by either moving the stable patients in the ICU or flying out the stable ones that are in the ER.
And Dr. Gonzalez, I wanted to ask you about also the situation in Juarez, which is off across the border, right across the border. It's often called the sister city of El Paso. It's actually, some people would argue that El Paso is actually a suburb of Juarez, which is such a much, much bigger city. Your sense of how the close relationship between these two cities has affected the COVID pandemic one way or the other?
Well, it's the same city in essence. It's called the Metroplex, Juarez, El Paso. And obviously, we have a lot of patients that are U.S. residents and U.S. citizens that reside in the other side of the border, and they can come in legally, obviously, and request to be seen and treated in El Paso as they're rightly citizens or residents. And obviously, we're seeing those patients come across the border. That impacts also our ability to continue to treat patients in the hospital. And they're at capacity as well. There's no place in Juarez, no hospital in Juarez that has available beds. So it's the same situation in essence.
Dr. Gonzalez, sorry, go ahead.
And this whole issue of the refusal of state officials to allow the municipality and the local officials to implement the kinds of restrictions on public gatherings and that you want to have. What's the impact of that on your being able to curb the pandemic?
Well, obviously, we are not going to be able to curb that surge in numbers without those mandates. Obviously, we're entering the influenza season, and we already are seeing patients presenting with both infections, with influenza and with COVID. Obviously, that doesn't help at all. We're pleading with the public to avoid visiting or bring in visitors during the holidays. Thanksgiving is in the next couple of weeks. We're asking them not to relax precautions and to avoid getting even their neighbors into their houses to celebrate. I think if we want to continue to celebrate these holidays next year, we need to sit out this one.
Can you talk, Dr. Gonzalez Ayala, about the rationing that we're hearing? We're hearing that the county judge, Ricardo Samaniego, has said that care is being rationed in El Paso hospitals. And can you talk about what that traveling nurse said, the horror of nurses working in the pit, leaving doctors not being able to go into that area or not going into that area, people just being left to die, and then prisoners being paid something like $2 an hour to move corpses? We're talking 10 mobile morgues that have been set up, all of this.
So I am in private practice. Although I have privileges at University Medical Center, I don't practice there. So I cannot speak to the situation at UMC. I haven't been there in a while. I am familiar with the Facebook video that this nurse posted. I know my colleagues in UMC and Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center, which staffs that hospital, very well. And I'm not sure that I can fully believe that account. These are very humane, very ethical, very professional physicians. I don't see that really happening. I doubt it, but I haven't been there. I can tell you that care is not being rationed in the private hospitals where I practice. Yes, we're overstretched. We are having to receive help from FEMA with physicians, nurses, respiratory therapists, nurse practitioners. We're grateful that we're receiving this help to staff the hospitals and continue to deliver the care that we alone, the people that live here in El Paso, the physicians that work here in El Paso, cannot provide on our own without that help. But we are not rationing care. I mean, we're limited by the number of beds we have available, but we're not deciding who lives and who dies. And that would be unethical and illegal. So I don't see that happening at this point in the facilities where I practice.
And Dr. Gonzalez, I wanted to ask you about as a frontline worker facing this pandemic, not only the problems that you see at the state level, but also at the national level, when you find that the White House itself often makes contradictory statements to those of the health professionals at the Centers for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health. Your sense of what the impact of these mixed messages from the political leadership has, the impact it has on your ability to work on the front lines?
Well, I think that the medical community has better judgment and understands that when, for example, Dr. Fauci speaks, he speaks with the truth. And I think we mostly follow his advice. He's an authority not only in the country, but worldwide. And even though we have a lot of political coming out from Washington, for the most part, what comes out of Dr. Fauci and most of what the CDC puts out is good advice, and we tend to follow it for the most part. When I hear this political messaging, I filter out what doesn't make sense to us from a scientific or medical standpoint.
Can you talk, Dr. Gonzalez Ayala, about Thanksgiving and what this means for El Paso? What message are you putting out right now? And also, if you could talk about being a pulmonologist and what that means, the kind of deadly combination, if you could talk more about the flu as well as COVID.
Well, the message we're trying to send again is, please, to everybody, avoid celebrating in person. It sounds terrible. It sounds like a draconian measure, but we're asking people not to go and visit anybody. I'm following up with patients that have recovered already from COVID over the last few months in my office via telephone encounters. And I have a lot of patients asking, hey, Dr. Gonzalez, can I go and visit my relatives in Houston or my relatives in California? I'm pleading with them, please don't go anywhere, stay put, even though you already caught COVID and we assumed you have some immunity, you can still catch another, virus. You can catch influenza. Stay put, don't go anywhere, and sit out this holiday so you can celebrate next year. Now, to the question of what it means to be a pulmonologist and dealing with this, I think that it's the experience that I've had never been exposed to. We're seeing this go completely beyond the point where we usually see it with the influenza peak in the months of January and February, where we have, yes, a lot of patients waiting for beds in the ER, but never to this extent. It's way beyond, never seen it before anywhere. And I've worked in Miami, and I worked in Houston, and obviously here in El Paso, I've never encountered these kinds of extremes where we're overrun with patients that are critically ill.
Well, Dr. Emilio Gonzalez Ayala, we want to thank you so much for being with us, leading pulmonary disease and critical care specialist. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, we go from El Paso, which is one of the hot spots of this country, to North Dakota, which currently has the highest COVID-19 death rate in the world. We will talk with a member of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and we'll go to Navajo Nation in Arizona, which is now going through yet another lockdown. Stay with us.
We can, we will, we are strong together. We can, we will, we are strong together. We can, we will, we are strong together. No, 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 no. It wasn't always perfect. Nothing ever is. Seems like it's been forever since it all began. My hand extends to yours. Meet halfway, a dangerous kind of silence. We shall overcome. We can, we will. We are strong together. We can, we will. We are strong together. Compassion's not a weakness, not about you or me, or push and pull confrontation. Let's cut the strings. Is it all or nothing? Nothing's as it seems when we stand together.
Strong Together, Vicey Hassan. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. This is the Quarantine Report as we go to North Dakota, which currently has the highest COVID-19 death rate of any state or country in the world, with 1 in every 1,000 residents dead from the virus. South Dakota's death rate is nearly as bad. After both state governments spent months downplaying the crisis, the Republican governors refusing to issue mask mandates until just recently in North Dakota. Over the weekend, facing rapidly spiking numbers, North Dakota's Governor Doug Burgum finally declared a statewide mask mandate, limited indoor restaurant capacity, and shut down high school sports. The move came just a week after he said infected but asymptomatic healthcare workers should still work and treat COVID-19 patients at hospitals. Meanwhile, the right-wing South Dakota Republican Governor Kristi Noem, a close Trump ally who welcomed him to Mount Rushmore, continues to deny the crisis, will not issue a mask mandate. A South Dakota emergency room nurse told CNN she's treated many patients who deny COVID-19 as making them ill, even as they're hospitalized and die of the disease. As COVID-19 ravages the Dakotas, we turn to look at how the rapid spread of COVID-19 is affecting Native American communities, which have already faced disproportionate infection and death rates throughout the pandemic. We're joined by Jody Archambault. She's a citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, the former special assistant to President Obama for Native American Affairs for the White House Domestic Policy Council. She's in the capital of North Dakota. She's in Bismarck. She's also the sister of the former chair of the Standing Rock Sioux, Dave Archambault. And in Farmington, New Mexico, we're joined by Ali Young, a citizen of Navajo Nation, founder of Protect the Sacred. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Jody, let's begin with you. North Dakota has the deadliest COVID death rate in the world. Can you talk about its effect on the Native American community there, of which you are a part?
Thank you, Amy. Sure. I would just like to say that this has been a tough several months, just hoping that the government takes action. The state government, the way that they behave and the way that they react affects our people directly, mostly because we have some of the highest rates of the underlying conditions that make COVID-19 a deadly disease. And so we're having a lot of people perish. We're having a lot of death, a lot of hospitalizations, and it's affecting us in ways that is not widely known by the rest of America. We have very few years. We have about maybe a decade, maybe 15 years where we have to save our language, our Lakota language, our Dakota language. We also have other tribes in North Dakota who, like the Arikara, the Mandan, and the Hidatsa, most of the speakers of our languages are over the age of 70. And we don't have very much time to spend with them and learn and protect and revitalize our languages. And COVID-19 has put on an additional layer of risk that is just putting us into a very difficult time.
And Jody Archambault, how did it get to this stage, especially in the Native communities of the state? How did the pandemic spread so rapidly in your community?
It didn't spread very rapidly at first. As you know, the COVID-19 hit the cities first and hit Seattle and New York City. In North Dakota and South Dakota, we shut down the businesses and took a lot of precautions early on until about May. And North and South Dakota were the first states to open their doors to business as usual. Restaurants, people were shy at first, but at this point, there's a lot of people who have followed the line of thinking that COVID-19 is a hoax or it's some kind of Democrat conspiracy. And a lot of people refuse to wear masks, even with the mask mandate. This has all accelerated on the reservations or tribal nations such as Eagle Butte, the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe and the Ogallala Sioux tribe, the Sisseton, Wahpeton, Rosebud, they've all installed roadblocks. They've all implemented roadblocks to stop traffic and outsiders from coming on the reservation. And the response to their action to protect tribal members, elders, and the like was for the Governor Noem to torture them and hold them hostage with funding. She's coordinated with the Trump administration to make it difficult to receive the federal resources that are allocated to the tribal governments, and have used that as a stick for them to try to force them to take the roadblocks down. And rather than supporting them and thanking them for trying to address the lack of health services available on the reservation, she's made it more and more difficult for our tribes to protect ourselves.
Dakota governor, can you talk about his originally saying that people who are healthcare workers who test positive for COVID should remain working if they are asymptomatic and treat COVID-19 patients, and Governor Burgum then being forced to back down after the outcry, saying no to a mask mandate, then saying yes?
I'll just tell you that it's really hard to speak up in North Dakota. The news sources out here don't cover an alternate perspective. But I will say that the Nurses Association and Advocacy Group did issue a press release after Governor Burgum said that they could go back to work while they were testing COVID positive. That was last week on Wednesday, and within hours there was a pushback from the Nurses Association. None of the hospitals have taken him up on the offer, and it's ridiculous that the leadership's response to being the worst COVID rates in the world would be to allow nurses to infect other nurses, other doctors, and other patients by coming to work with COVID. It's the most preposterous type of government action that I've ever heard of. So the business of the hospital is asking for this kind of, I guess, allowance to allow sick people without symptoms to come and spread. But actually, the situation that we're talking about is the lack of compassion for those elders, not just Native elders, but all elders, all people with underlying health conditions like cancer. It is an absolute choice, a clear choice to choose profit over people. So the governor isn't putting people first, he's putting profit first. And the same with Governor Noem down in South Dakota. She has been actively asking people to come to South Dakota, come to the second hottest spot in the world, and have your vacation, because we don't care if you wear a mask or not. That's what her response is. And to increase the risk that tribal governments, by forcing them to take down their barriers or trying to force them down, they haven't taken them down. It's remarkable that they're able to stick to that governance decision that is saving lives on the reservations. It's still spreading. It's still spreading on the reservations because there is active commerce between reservations and cities, and so it's getting in.
Yeah, I'd like to bring in Ali Young to the conversation, a citizen of the Navajo Nation and founder of Protect the Sacred. Ali, welcome to Democracy Now! Could you talk about the situation in Navajo Nation in terms of COVID, and also maybe comment on the fact that not all Native areas have gaming, but quite a significant percentage do, and often it's the gaming revenues that help provide health services or social services. Could you talk about the impact of the shutdowns on the ability of the Native peoples to provide health services as well?
Yeah. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Yeah, right now we are seeing another surge in Navajo Nation, as we expected. We, as you all know, we're the #1 hotspot in the country per capita in the spring. And we worked hard to flatten the curve, and we were able to. There was a day where we had 0 reported cases. But recently, because of the spikes across the country, what we've been seeing throughout the nation with some of the rallies, I mean, you know, some of our border towns around here are Trump territory. And so there were rallies that I witnessed. And a lot of our people come into these border towns to do their shopping, because on Navajo Nation, you know, we have like 13 grocery stores. So we have to travel to these territories where they're not thinking about, they're not wearing masks, and they're not thinking about their neighbors who've been impacted. And then to your point about the gaming industry and in Native communities at Navajo Nation, we have some casinos and hotels as well, and they've all been shut down, and it has impacted us economically and financially. And as far as healthcare, we've had to, you know, I worked on a PSA through Protect the Sacred that called out for medical volunteers, and that's you know, the state that we were in, that we had to make that call out for PPE supplies, medical volunteers, because we just lack all of those resources and funding in our tribal communities when, you know, we're supposed to be guaranteed quality healthcare through our treaties with the federal government.
And Ali Young, you've talked about feeling that so many Native elders are suffering as a result of the decades of uranium mining, particularly of pulmonary and respiratory diseases, making them even more vulnerable. We're talking something like over 600 people just on the Navajo reservation have died as of this weekend of COVID.
Yes, that is something that I am trying to connect the dots to anyone I speak to, is let's not forget about how the federal government greenlit these companies coming in to extract our minerals and tribal reservations. In Navajo Nation for 30+ years, we had Peabody up in the northwestern region of Navajo Nation, which was our hotspot within the nation. And a lot of our people up there, the waters and our lands are contaminated by uranium. And our elders had to work through, and even my own uncles, you know, they just shut down last year in 2019. So a lot of our people have worked through those unsafe environments, and certainly have those pre-existing and underlying conditions that we need to consider, and why we're so vulnerable to this virus.
We're going to break and then come back to talk about what Native Americans can do, and that has to do with voting, which certainly people came out in force. We'd like to ask you to stay with us, Ali. We're also going to be joined by Native American from Wisconsin. But Jody Archambault, in this last 30 seconds that we have you, can you overall talk about the massive voter turnout, at least increase in Native American turnout, not noted in the mainstream media?
Sure. I just want to say that despite the risk of being exposed to COVID, the numbers were incredible. And I think that this is something that is often overlooked by mainstream media, only because mainstream media has a tendency to leave out the full picture when it comes to Native Americans. In fact, CNN did an infographic, and they labeled, they did a breakdown of all the different people who voted in the election. And for Native Americans, they didn't have us labeled as Native Americans. They called us something else.
We have that actual graphic right here. It says white, it says Latinx, it says black, and then, or Latino, black, and then something else, and then Asian.
Yep. Yep. And social media, we are very much our resiliency is through our humor. And so it just took off. Everybody kept saying, like, Custer said, yeah, they sure are something else, you know, Custer from the last couple of centuries ago. And a lot of people have just taken it as a call to try to bring attention to the people at CNN, to the people at the mainstream who just continuously don't see us. They don't see us, and it's intentional because we are a reminder of the bloodshed that it took to make this country. We're not congruent with the American dream, and we're still here. We're actually leading the way on how to handle pandemics, because we've been through so many of them, and it's so much ingrained in our communities that we're not seeing this as, we're not victims in this. We're actually ready to fight. We're ready to push back and do what we can to protect ourselves, because it's the only way we've made it this far. And we know that people in America don't see us, so we have to do it for ourselves.
Yeah, and Jody, I wanted to comment on this because I also, when I saw this this figure of something else or other in these exit polls, tried to dig down a little deeper into what was behind it, especially since it had appeared to grow by about a percentage point from the previous election. It turns out that this is a catch-all placeholder where they include people who identify themselves as multiracial, people who declined in the exit polls to identify their race, and also Native Americans. So it's a catch-all, which it's indefensible, but it is a complex number. And it turns out that about 2/3 of those who identified as other or something else voted for Joe Biden versus Donald Trump. So it's a shortcut for the exit poll people not have to do a better job of being able to parse the various parts of the electorate.
Well, we want to thank Jody Archambault for joining us, citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe in North Dakota. And we're going to continue on this issue that Juan is just addressing with Ali Young, who led horseback riders to the polls. She's a citizen of the Navajo Nation, founder of Protect the Sacred. And we're going to go to Wisconsin to speak with a Native American man who's been analyzing the Native American vote. No, it's not something else. It is the Native American nations of this country. Stay with us.
I'm gonna take my horse to the voting poll. I'm gonna vote until I can't no more. I'm gonna take my horse to the voting poll. I'm gonna vote until I can't no more. Take my horse to the voting poll. I'm gonna vote until I can't no more. I'm gonna take my horse to the voting poll. I'm gonna vote until I can't no more.
Tia Woods singing Ride to the Polls, a song cover of Old Town Road by Lil Nas and Billy Ray Cyrus. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we continue to look at how Native American voters in key swing states helped to turn the 2020 presidential election for Joe Biden due to a massive increase in Native voter participation. As we reported on election night, CNN sparked swift backlash after posting an image of voter demographics, which included a racial category labeling Native American voters as, quote, something else. They would later apologize. In fact, it was Native American voters who helped flip several states for Biden in this year's presidential showdown. In Arizona, a state that has not gone blue since 1996, Navajo voters turned out in much higher rates than 2016. After a massive grassroots effort to get out the vote. In Wisconsin, where Biden won by just 21,000 votes, there was also a surge in Native American voter participation that helped turn the state blue. Trump won Wisconsin in 2016. For more on voting in Indian country and the critical role Native voters played in this election, we're joined from Wisconsin by Burton Warrington. He's president of Indian Avid Group. He is a lawyer who served in the Interior Department. He is Menominee, Potawatomi, and Ho-Chunk. Still with us in Arizona is Ali Young, a citizen of the Navajo Nation and founder of Protect the Sacred. Ali, if you could start off by talking about what you did in Arizona. Talk about the horseback ride that you took. Actually, I understand you're now in New Mexico.
Yes, I am. Yeah, my mom lives here in New Mexico, and so I'm with my sister and my mother right now. I worked with my father, who lives in Rough Rock, Arizona. Sorry, and we worked together. And I've always voted in Arizona. Sided with my father, and we've always done trail rides. That's our bonding thing. And we've done them throughout Navajo Nation. And this year, when we were thinking about the election, he wanted to do a Biden-Harris trail ride. And when I called him back and thought about the significance of a trail ride and the respect that our people have for the horses, and as we call it, horse medicine. And horse medicine is when you are in rhythm with the horse and almost in sync, and you're reconnected and refocused as you ride in our own homelands and are reminded of exactly what our ancestors have fought for, our lands to still be in our own homelands, and our cultures, and also our right to vote. So I went back to my father and I said, so what's happening with the trail ride? And he said, yeah, I don't know. I don't think we're going to do it. And I said, I think we should do it. But with Protect the Sacred, I have to be nonpartisan. So if it's more of a getting folks out to the polls so that they can cast their ballots, I think we should do that, because at the same time, I think that our Native American youth, I was hearing on the ground that they weren't feeling very motivated to participate in this election, as a lot of other communities of color, because, why continue participating in a system that has never worked for us? It is not working for us. And I wanted to communicate to them that this is an election that we just cannot sit out.
You're talking to me, Julie?
Keep going, Ali.
And so I wanted them to. I often find that our Native youth are, we are more educated than ever. That's why there's this resistance, because, we know our history and what has happened to us historically. And also we're more connected to technology and information than ever. And we're more eager to reconnect to our cultures, and that respect for our ancestors and our elders are still there. And so I wanted to strategize and use that and say, okay, let's find something that will excite our Native youth, that's rooted in our culture, that will also help us reclaim Arizona, because I keep saying that Arizona is indigenous DNA. It is not Republican DNA, as I heard on the news when I was watching about a month before we decided to do trail ride to the polls. And that's what really motivated me, is because Arizona has this deep history of many tribal communities, and it is not just a place where white conservatives go to retire. And this is our homeland, and I called on my people, let's show up, let's show them that we're still here, let's be represented, let's make sure that we have a seat at the table and that our voices are heard. And so that's why it was so important, and I'm so happy that a lot of young people did come out. It did excite them. I got so many positive messages from our efforts, and I think it was a positive turnout.
And Ali, I wanted to ask you about that. What were the results? What you've been able to tell? Not so much, obviously, because the exit polls didn't factor in or count Native American votes. But what's been the results and the actual vote totals that you've been able to see so far?
Yeah, well, I believe around 60-something thousand Navajos in Navajo Nation. So we, Coconino County, Navajo County, which is where I did all of my work, and I vote in Navajo County, and Apache County, they all overlap the Navajo Nation. And in those areas, Navajo people turned out to vote. I think 84% of those who had registered turned out to vote, and 97% of those who cast their ballot voted for Joe Biden. And that's just incredible. That just shows the contribution of the Native vote in key swing states, in not only the Navajo Nation, but there is a map that compares tribal communities, and all of those tribal communities voted blue. And so we came out strong. I think we did do a great job in reclaiming Arizona, saying that we're still here, that we've always been here, and that now, we're going to keep working to hold this new administration accountable as well.
You not only organized Navajo voters, Ali, but one of the hardest groups, not so much to organize, to get out in the streets, to be activist, but to actually vote. And that's young people. Maybe it's because of your last name, Ali Young, but you sure managed to galvanize a lot of young people. What kind of message do you have for what is the most effective way to get first-time voters involved, to make them feel like they really are making a difference when it's, they haven't done this before?
Well, my strategy was all around, you got to think about what we're working with. And with young people, we are very tuned in to social media. So definitely it is a powerful tool. So connecting with them that way, we had a huge social media strategy. And also, layering in the cultural revitalization and is particularly with Native youth, and but also I think with a lot of other youth across other communities of color, because I think we're in this amazing moment where all of our communities of color are reconnecting to our cultures and really proud of who we are and where we come from. So using that and saying let's show up in that way. Let's show through social media, fighting for our representation. That takes work, and we have to, we're not just going to automatically, be talked about in the media. We have to show up, and that's the messaging that I used, especially for, for Native people who were too often invisible in the media. We're called something else. And so, let's turn that on its head. Let's show them that we're still here. We're not going away. And we're gonna make our statement. And I think that's really effective with especially our leaders, our young leaders today. We are very progressive. We are, I think, as Native people, we're innately activist and political. Because we're not even supposed to be here. That's definitely the messaging
Ali,
and strategy that I use.
Ali, we have less than a minute left, but I'm wondering just if you could quickly say what your main expectations are of the new Biden administration's policy toward the Native American people.
Yeah, well, we're definitely going to be making sure that we're represented, especially when it comes to climate change. We do want a seat at the table. We want to be in that conversation because we have just incredible knowledge about how the ways that we respect Mother Earth, that we honor Mother Earth, and those are things that will end up saving Mother Earth. And so learning from us and collaborating with us, and also on issues of we're still in COVID-19 and it's still severely impacting our tribal communities. So we're expecting them to work with us and helping us to bring the funding and the aid that we need, because $8 billion was not enough in the initial stimulus package.
We want to thank you so much, Ali Young, for being with us. Citizen of the Navajo Nation, organized throughout Arizona, is in New Mexico now, and founder of Protect the Sacred. And we will bring you Burton Warrington, Menominee, Potawatomi, and Ho-Chunk at DemocracyNow.org to talk about the critical Native voter count in Wisconsin. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Stay safe, wear a mask, save lives.